There is an idea that has become so deeply embedded in the fabric of Western civilization that most people perceive it as an obvious fact about human nature, rather than a religious doctrine. The idea that a person is born with an inherent flaw, that something damaged lives within us from the very beginning, inherited from distant ancestors, that we carry guilt for another's act committed millennia ago. This idea is original sin, and it has so thoroughly permeated not only theology, but also philosophy, literature, psychology, even secular notions of human nature, that when you learn that for Judaism this idea simply does not exist, it sounds like a discovery. This is not an exaggeration. This is precisely how people react upon first learning this fact. How is this possible? After all, Judaism and Christianity grew from the same sources. After all, Jews also read the book of Genesis. After all, the story of Adam and Eve is present in both traditions. But the answer to this bewilderment is the main subject of today's investigation. Here is the first puzzle of our investigation. Judaism and Christianity grew from the same texts. The third chapter of the book of Genesis, the story of Adam, Eve, the forbidden fruit, and the expulsion from Eden, is a sacred text for both traditions. Both traditions read it, study it, interpret it. But from this one text, Christianity derived the doctrine of original sin, which became central to its entire anthropology, while Judaism not only did not accept this doctrine, but never even had it. How is this possible if the source text is the same? The second puzzle is even more acute. If Judaism does not know original sin, then this changes everything. The image of a person changes. The understanding of sin and repentance changes. The meaning of the commandments changes. The attitude towards the body, towards death, towards sexuality, towards the very possibility of a righteous life changes. In other words, the absence of one doctrine entails a fundamentally different view of what it means to be human and what God expects from this human. This is not a marginal theological divergence. It is a divergence at the very foundation. Today we will conduct an investigation that will begin in the Garden of Eden and end at the very heart of the Jewish understanding of human nature. We will analyze what exactly happened to Adam and Eve in the third chapter of Genesis according to the Jewish reading, why Christianity arrived at the idea of original sin, why this idea is absent in Jewish sources, and what Judaism offers instead. Because instead there is something very concrete, very well considered, and in a sense more demanding than the doctrine that seems pessimistic. Let's start with the text that stands at the center of this entire dispute. The third chapter of the book of Genesis is well known to most people, at least in its general outline. God places Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, forbids eating fruit from one specific tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The serpent persuades Eve to violate this prohibition. Eve eats and gives to Adam, after which both become aware of their nakedness, hide from God, and in the end, God expels them from the garden. Eve receives punishment in the form of pain in childbirth and subordination to her husband, Adam, in the form of hard labor on the land. The serpent in the form of a curse to crawl on its belly and be in enmity with the woman's offspring. At the end, God makes them garments of skin, and they leave Eden forever. This text, everyone knows this. But here is what significantly fewer people know. Nowhere in this text is there the word sin. There is no word fall. There is no concept of transmitting guilt to subsequent generations. There is no indication that the nature of Adam and Eve changed ontologically, that is, at the level of their very being. The text describes consequences, specific punishments, specific changes in living conditions. But these consequences are described for Adam, Eve, and the serpent, not for all subsequent people. Moreover, if you read further into the 4th chapter, the story of Cain and Abel describes a murder committed without any reference to Adam's hereditary sin. Cain kills Abel not because he inherited a corrupted nature. He kills out of envy and jealousy, which are his own feelings. And God, before the murder, warns Cain that he can overcome this temptation if he wishes. This is a key warning. Can you master it implies a positive answer. If Cain fundamentally could not master his evil inclination due to an inherited corrupted nature, such a question would be a cruel mockery. But God asks it seriously because he knows Cain can. He chose wrongly. This is his choice, not his fate. Further, even more interesting, the word sin, chet in Hebrew, in the book of Genesis first appears not in the 3rd chapter, but in the 4th, when God speaks with Cain before the murder of Abel. God says to Cain, "Sin is crouching at your door." Genesis 4th chapter, 7th verse. Sin here is described as something that lies in wait for Cain from the outside, like a beast at the threshold, like an external force that a person can and must overcome. This is not a description of hereditary corruption. It is a description of temptation, which is always nearby, but which one can fight. Can you master it? That is what is important, not that it initially lives within you as part of your nature. This distinction is fundamental for understanding everything that follows. The Jewish reading of the 4th chapter of Genesis says, "Sin is not part of a person. It is something that is near a person. It is not an illness. It is a danger, and a danger can be dealt with." So how then does Judaism read the 3rd chapter of Genesis? What exactly happened to Adam and Eve according to the Jewish understanding, if not the fall in the Christian sense? In the Jewish tradition, the story of Adam and Eve is understood primarily as a story of maturation and the acquisition of moral consciousness. Before Eve ate the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, Adam and Eve lived in a state that can be described as pre-conscious. They did not distinguish between good and evil. They did not have moral choice in the full sense of the word. That is precisely why they were not ashamed of their nakedness. They simply did not know this category of shame. When they ate the fruit, they acquired that very knowledge which makes a human a moral being, the ability to distinguish between good and evil, and consequently, responsibility for one's actions. This reading, which can be found in many rabbinic authorities, sees in the act of Adam and Eve not a catastrophe, but a transition to a new state, painful, accompanied by losses, but fundamentally necessary for the realization of the human vocation. Without acquiring moral consciousness, a person could not fulfill the commandments, because the commandments presuppose the distinction between good and evil. A person deprived of this distinction is not a moral being, but simply a living one. Adam and Eve became human in the full sense precisely when they left Eden, because only outside, in the world with its difficulties and choices, is a true moral life possible. Maimonides, one of the most profound interpreters of Jewish thought, in his Guide for the Perplexed, offers precisely such a reading. He writes that before tasting the fruit, Adam distinguished between true and false. This is a purely intellectual ability related to the cognition of objective reality. After tasting, He acquired the ability to distinguish between good and evil. This is a moral ability, which presupposes subjective choice and freedom. Thus, the tasting of the fruit was not a degradation, but an acquisition of a new ability, albeit at the cost of losing the former ease of existence in the garden under the direct management of God. This reading means that Judaism looks at the story of Eden optimistically, not in the sense that there is no tragedy in it, but in the sense that it describes not the corruption of man, but his becoming. Man left Eden not broken, but grown up. The difficulties of life outside Eden, hard labor, pain in childbirth, mortality, are the price of adulthood, not punishment for an innate flaw. Interestingly, some rabbinic sources contain both a motif of sympathy for Adam and Eve and an understanding of their act as inevitable. Man was given a desire to know, and he used it. This is not a justification for disobedience, but it is an acknowledgement that the very desire for knowledge is part of human nature, which God placed within him. This complex attitude towards the story of Eden, acknowledging both the violation and its inevitability, reflects the richness of the Jewish exegetical tradition, which never reduced complex text to a single, simple meaning. Interestingly, among Jewish thinkers there is no single opinion about the meaning of the Eden story, and this in itself is indicative of the nature of Jewish religious thought. The Talmud contains various opinions, often contradictory, and this is not considered a problem. It is considered a richness. Some rabbis said that death indeed entered the world through Adam's sin, and in this sense the consequences of his act affected all humanity. Others interpreted the same thing more softly. Mortality is a condition of human existence, which is possibly connected to this story, but does not mean inherited guilt. Still others ask the question, were Adam and Eve truly immortal before the expulsion from Eden? Or is mortality part of created nature as such? There was agreement on one point. Even if death came through Adam, it does not mean that every person bears personal guilt for his act. Consequences, yes. Guilt, no. This distinction between consequences and guilt is key. In the Jewish understanding, mortality, labor, and suffering are the conditions of human life after Eden. But they are not a punishment that each person bears as guilty. They are the conditions in which each person lives and in which he makes his own choice. It is this choice that determines his moral fate, not the inherited sin of a distant ancestor. In Judaism, there exists a fundamental principle. Each person is responsible only for his own actions. One cannot bear guilt for what another person has done, even if that other person is one's ancestor. Each person comes into the world with a pure soul, and what he does with that soul is his responsibility and his alone. This assertion is so important for Judaism that it is literally woven into the fabric of daily practice. The morning prayer that a Jew recites immediately upon waking contains the following words: My God, the soul which you have placed within me is pure. You created it, you formed it, you breathed it into me. Neshama shenatata b'tehorah hi. These are the first meaningful words a person utters at the beginning of the day, even before breakfast, before the news, before any tasks. A pure soul. Every morning, regardless of what happened yesterday. This is not a naive denial of yesterday's mistakes. It is a reminder of the raw material with which a person works and what his potential is. This principle is directly formulated in the Torah. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 16. Fathers shall not be put to death for children, and children shall not be put to death for fathers. Each shall be put to death for his own crime. This is a legal principle in the context of criminal legislation, but it reflects a deeper theological conviction. Guilt is not transmitted by inheritance. And it is important to emphasize here, this principle is formulated not as an exception and not as a clarification to some other rule. It is formulated as a foundation, as that from which the entire system proceeds. The accused is responsible for his own, not for another's. This is not only a legal norm, but also an anthropological assertion. A person is the author of his actions, not a victim of another's. The prophet Ezekiel returns to this principle with a detail that leaves little room for ambiguity. In the 18th chapter of his book, God tells the prophet, "The soul that sins shall die. The son shall not bear the iniquity of the father, neither shall the father bear the iniquity of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon him, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon him." Ezekiel chapter 18. This is not merely a legal commentary, it is a fundamental theological statement about the nature of guilt. It is individual, it is not transferable, it does not accumulate through generations. Interestingly, it appears that the 18th chapter of Ezekiel was written specifically in response to a particular problem. Among the Jews living in Babylonian exile, a proverb was widespread. The fathers have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge. This expressed a feeling that the current generation was suffering for the sins of the previous ones. Ezekiel directly argues against this proverb, saying, "No, each person is responsible for themselves." This is not a theological abstraction. It is a practical answer to a living problem, and the answer is completely unambiguous. Guilt is not inherited. The same prophet Ezekiel gives an even more specific description. He says, "If a man is righteous, does justice and righteousness, does not eat upon the mountains, does not lift his eyes to idols, does not defile his neighbor's wife, does not oppress anyone, he lives, he is righteous. And if he fathers a son who does all the opposite, he shall die, bearing his own guilt." Ezekiel chapter 18. Each generation starts from zero. The father's guilt does not drag down a righteous son, and the father's righteousness does not compensate for the son's lawlessness. This is a fundamentally different understanding of moral reality than what the doctrine of original sin assumes. And again, this is not a marginal text, not a single phrase in a poetic context. It is an entire chapter dedicated specifically to this issue, clearly written to refute the idea of hereditary guilt. Now is the time to pause and ask the question that inevitably arises. If Judaism does not know original sin, where did it even come from? How did this powerful theological doctrine, central to the Christian understanding of humanity, history, and salvation, grow from the same texts? Historians of religion give a fairly clear answer to this question. The concept of original sin, as it exists in Christianity, is not a direct consequence of reading the 3rd chapter of Genesis. It is the result of a long theological development that began in the early Christian community and received systematic form primarily thanks to the Apostle Paul and later Aurelius Augustine. The Apostle Paul, in the Epistle to the Romans, chapter 5, verse 12, writes, "Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, so death spread to all men because all sinned." This is a key text for the Christian doctrine of original sin. Paul draws a direct parallel. As through Adam came sin and death, so through Christ came righteousness and life. This parallel has a specific theological purpose. It explains why a Messiah is needed as a redeemer. If sin is universal and hereditary, then a universal redemptive sacrifice is needed. It is important to understand that this line of Paul's thought is a theological reasoning built from considerations of systematicity, not simply a literal reading of the 3rd chapter of Genesis. Paul needed to explain how the suffering and death of one man could have significance for all humanity. The concept of hereditary sin affecting all humanity provided a symmetrical answer. As Adam's sin touched all, so Christ's redemption could touch all. Here it is worth paying attention to a detail in Paul's very text that often escapes notice when reading. The Greek original of the 5th verse of the 5th chapter of the Epistle to the Romans allows for several translations. The phrase, "because all sinned," can also be translated as, "in whom all sinned." That is, in the sense that in Adam, as in a prototype, all people are already contained and consequently partake in his sin. Jerome's Latin Vulgate translated it exactly this way: "in quo omnes peccaverant," in whom all sinned. And it is precisely this translation tradition that became the basis for the Western teaching on original sin. But the Greek text allows for another reading, and in Eastern Orthodox theology, the interpretation of this passage has historically been somewhat different. The emphasis was placed not on hereditary guilt, but on hereditary mortality. All die because death entered the world through Adam, not because all literally bear his guilt. Augustus Aurelius, known to us as Blessed Augustine, who lived in the 4th, 5th centuries A.D. in North Africa, took Paul's thesis and developed it into a systematic doctrine that became normative for Western Christianity. According to Augustine, Adam's sin did not simply introduce death into the world. It damaged human nature itself. After the fall, the human will became damaged, incapable of consistently choosing good without God's grace. This defect of the will is transmitted biologically, through birth, to every descendant of Adam. Every person born carries this defect within them, not as personal guilt, but as a state of damage requiring healing. It was Augustine who gave this concept its Latin name, peccatum originale, original sin. And it was his formulation that became standard for Catholicism, and through it, in modified variants, for most Protestant traditions. Interestingly, Augustine himself arrived at such a strict understanding of original sin in the course of a polemic with the British monk Pelagius, who argued that a person is capable of achieving righteousness by their own strength, without the indispensable grace of God. Augustine argued against this position, developing an increasingly rigid understanding of the will's damage. Thus, the strict form of the doctrine of original sin is largely a product of a specific polemic of the 4th, 5th centuries, not an inevitable conclusion from the text of Genesis. But here it is important to say that Paul, in that very 5th chapter of the Epistle to the Romans, was speaking more about physical mortality, which came through Adam, and about the fact that all sin, not about the fact that all are born guilty. The distinction is subtle but fundamental. Between all sin and all are born guilty lies a vast chasm, and it is into this space that Jewish anthropology fits. Judaism is quite ready to agree that people sin. This is an obvious fact, And that is precisely why Judaism has such a developed system of repentance and correction. But people sin, and people are born guilty for another's sin. These are fundamentally different statements. Now let us consider what Judaism offers instead of the doctrine of original sin, because it is not an empty space, not simply the absence of something, but a fully developed and consistent picture of human nature. In Judaism, there is no original sin, but there is a concept usually called the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Hatov, the evil inclination and the good inclination. This is not dualism in the sense of two gods or two equal forces. It is a description of two drives living within each person. Yetzer Hara literally translates as evil inclination or evil urge, but this name is somewhat misleading because in tradition the Yetzer Hara is understood quite differently. The Yetzer Hara is not innate evil. It is a life force, energy, desire, instinct. It is what drives a person, what makes them strive, desire, achieve, create. Without the Yetzer Hara, says the Talmud in Tractate Sanhedrin, a person would not build houses, would not marry, would not have children, would not engage in trade. It is what makes a person active, productive, passionate. In itself, this inclination is not evil. It becomes evil when it is misdirected, when it is unbridled, when it is not under the control of the good inclination. One of the Talmudic rabbis tells such a story. Once the sages caught the Yetzer Hara and locked it up. But soon they discovered that in the whole country, children stopped being born, houses were not built, trade ceased, life came to a standstill. They had to release it back. This is a parable about the Yetzer Hara being a necessary engine of human life. The problem is not that it exists, but that it can overflow its banks. The Yetzer Hatov, the good inclination, is the voice of conscience, reason, moral judgment. It is what holds the Yetzer Hara within boundaries, what directs the life force into the channel of commandments and right actions. Tradition says that the Yetzer Hatov awakens later. In Jewish tradition, it is believed that around the age of 13 for boys and 12 for girls. This is where bar and bat mitzvah come from, the moment when a person becomes responsible for their actions, because the good inclination within them is sufficiently developed to manage the evil one. This concept differs fundamentally from the doctrine of original sin for several reasons. First, it does not speak of a damage or defect of nature. It speaks of two forces, both of which are part of a normal person. The Yetzer Hara is not an illness requiring treatment, but an energy requiring management. Second, this description is not pessimistic. On the contrary, it assumes that a person by nature is capable of choosing correctly. The good inclination in them is strong enough to manage the evil one, if only the person makes an effort. Third, and this is perhaps the most important, the concept of the two inclinations places the moral struggle in a very concrete and practical context. It is not a metaphysical war between good and evil on the level of ontology. It is a daily choice that each person makes in each specific situation, and each time they can choose correctly. There is no initial damage that would make the right choice impossible without external intervention. The Talmud offers this image. A person is like a ball of thread in which two threads are intertwined. One pulls in one direction, the other in another. It is up to the person which one they choose to follow. This is an image of freedom, not illusory, not conditional, but a real ability to choose. And this is perhaps the best illustration of why Judaism does not need the concept of original sin. There is no initial corruption that needs to be overcome. There is a struggle, always possible, always open in both directions. It is here that one of the most fundamental differences between Jewish and Christian theology on the question of human nature arises: the question of free will. In the doctrine of original sin, in its Augustinian version, human free will after the fall is fundamentally limited. The human will is so damaged that it is incapable of consistently choosing good without God's grace. That is precisely why grace is a necessary condition for salvation. A person cannot save themselves. In Judaism, free will is not merely a theoretical principle, but a practical foundation of the entire religious system. If a person were not capable of choice, the commandments would be meaningless. How can one demand from a person the observance of 613 commandments if their will is fundamentally damaged and they are incapable of consistently making the right choice? Maimonides dedicated a special section to this question in the Laws of Repentance, one of the sections of the Mishneh Torah, asserting that free will is absolute. Every person at every moment is capable of choosing good or evil, and precisely for that reason they bear full responsibility for this choice. Maimonides writes with a sharpness rare for a theological text. Do not allow into your heart the thought that the foolish nations of the world and most of the unwise among the children of Israel preach, that God predestines a person from birth to be righteous or wicked. This is a direct polemic with any version of predestination or fundamental limitation of the will. Judaism insists a person chooses their own path, and precisely for that reason they are rewarded or punished for this choice. This does not mean that Judaism naively believes a righteous life is easy. On the contrary, Judaism fully understands that following the commandments is difficult, that the Yetzer Hara, evil inclination, is strong, and that people stumble again and again. But this is the difficulty of effort, not the difficulty of fundamental impossibility. A person is capable. This is the basic assumption, and it is precisely this that makes them responsible. From this stems another fundamental difference in the understanding of repentance and forgiveness. Judaism has a highly developed system of teshuvah, returning. This word is usually translated as repentance, but literally means turning or returning. Teshuvah is not merely regret for what was done. It is an active process of correction. To realize one has done something wrong, to abandon that behavior, to make restitution for the damage caused, if possible, to apologize to the one who was wronged, and to form a firm intention not to repeat it in the future. It is noteworthy that in the Jewish concept of teshuvah, an intermediary is not needed. If a person has sinned against another person, they must reconcile with that other person. No third party, no priest as a mediator between people. If a person has sinned against God, they turn to God directly through prayer and a change in behavior. The idea that forgiveness requires mediation through someone else is foreign to Jewish theology, precisely because there is no hereditary flaw requiring a complex mechanism of atonement. Maimonides describes complete teshuvah as follows. What constitutes complete return? It is when a person finds themselves in the same situation where they previously sinned and has the opportunity to commit the same sin again, but refrains, not out of fear or weakness, but because they have changed. This is a very concrete, very practical criterion, not a feeling, not an experience, not a ritual, but a real change in behavior, tested in real circumstances. One of Maimonides' most famous statements on this matter goes, "Great and mighty is repentance. It brings a person closer to God. Yesterday this person was separated from the Lord, the God of Israel, and today they have cleaved to the Shekinah, the divine presence." This is not a description of something exceptional, accessible only to saints. It is a description of what is available to every person on any day of their life. There is another aspect of this issue that often remains in the shadows, but which is very important for understanding how the absence of original sin affects practical life. This is the attitude toward the body. In Christian theology, especially in its Western version, the story of the fall has often been linked with sexuality. And while this is not an obligatory element of the doctrine of original sin itself, Augustine and other theologians connected Adam's sin with lust, with the idea that after the fall, sexual desire escaped the control of reason. From this grew a long tradition of suspicious attitude toward the body, toward sexuality, toward the carnal as the sphere closest to sin. Judaism takes a fundamentally different position in this regard. The body in Judaism is not a prison for the soul, not a source of impurity as such, not something that needs to be tamed or despised. The body is created by God and is good. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Genesis 1:31. Sexuality within marriage is not only permitted, but obligatory. The Torah directly states that a husband must not deprive his wife of her conjugal rights, which includes sexual relations, and this is a commandment, not merely a permission. Fasting and abstinence exist in Judaism, especially on Yom Kippur, but they are not an expression of contempt for the body. They are a temporary shift in emphasis, a reminder that a person is not constituted by the body alone. Deriving pleasure from food, from rest, from the beauty of the world, all of this in Judaism is not only not condemned, but is often viewed as a way of glorifying God, who created it all. The Talmud contains a remarkable statement. In the world to come, a person will have to give an account for every permissible thing they could have enjoyed, but did not. This is a direct opposition to asceticism as a virtue. Not to use the good things of this world means not to properly appreciate what was created by God. The blessings a Jew recites throughout the day include blessings for food, for fragrance, for the sight of beautiful objects, for a beautiful view of nature. This is not a concession to weakness, but an acknowledgement that the physical world is a gift deserving of gratitude. This difference in attitude toward the body is directly connected to the difference in anthropology. If there is no original sin that particularly affected sexual desire and bodily appetites, then the body is a neutral instrument, and its desires need direction and boundaries, but not suppression as such. The commandments provide this direction. They do not say, suppress your body. They say, use your body in accordance with how it was intended. This is a fundamentally different attitude, not a war with the body, but cooperation with it within God-given limits. Let us pause here and look at the overall picture, because we have already advanced quite far in our investigation, and it is time to draw an interim conclusion. Judaism does not know original sin, not because it reads the 3rd chapter of Genesis carelessly or avoids difficult questions, but because its own reading of this text and its own theology lead to completely different conclusions. The text of Genesis contains no formulation of hereditary guilt. The books of the prophets, especially Ezekiel, directly assert the opposite principle. Guilt is not transferred. The concept of the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Hatov, good inclination, describes a person as a being capable of moral choice, not as a being fundamentally damaged. Free will is absolute and is the foundation of the entire system of commandments. But this does not mean that Judaism views a person with naive optimism. Judaism fully understands that people sin, that the Yetzer Hara is strong, that the path of righteousness requires constant effort. The annual cycle of the Jewish religious year is built around the theme of sin, repentance, and forgiveness. The 10 days between Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, and Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, are a time of intense self-examination, teshuvah, and prayer. This is not an empty formality. It is a serious spiritual practice involving an honest look at oneself. In the Yom Kippur prayers, Jews enumerate categories of sins, a long list covering a wide variety of transgressions, from pride to deceit, from hatred of one's neighbor to wrongly spoken words. This is not a list of sins a person has inherited. It is a list of sins they have committed. And that is precisely why one can turn away from them and not return to them. The difference is not that Judaism denies the reality of sin in human life, but in how it understands the nature of that sin. Sin in Judaism is a miss, an error of choice, a deviation from the right path. The very word het, sin in Hebrew, literally means a miss, like an archer who misses the target. It is not an ontological corruption, not a hereditary flaw, not a damage to nature. It is a specific wrongful act committed by a specific person, for which they, not their ancestors, bear responsibility. And precisely because sin is a specific act of a specific person and not a hereditary condition, teshuvah, return, is always possible. At any moment in life, for any person, without intermediaries, without the need for a redemptive sacrifice for a hereditary flaw. God does not demand the impossible from a person. He demands precisely what a person is capable of doing: to acknowledge, to stop, to correct, to return. One of Maimonides' most famous statements on this matter goes, "Great and mighty is repentance. It brings a person closer to God. Yesterday this person was separated from the Lord, the God of Israel, and today they have cleaved to the Shekinah, the divine presence." This is not a description of something exceptional, accessible only to saints. It is a description of what is available to every person on any day of their life. And it is here that Judaism offers something that is fundamentally impossible in a system of hereditary sin. The Talmud states, "Where those who have done teshuvah, people who have returned after sins, stand, even the completely righteous are not permitted to stand." This is not a justification for sin or a call to sin intentionally. It is a testimony that a person who has fallen and risen again has acquired something that cannot be acquired without this experience. They have seen both shores. They know the real price of choice. They have won a real struggle. This is impossible in a system where sin is a hereditary flaw of nature. There, growth is possible only through external intervention. But in a system where sin is an error of choice, and teshuvah is a real turn in the opposite direction, return is a genuine personal achievement. Now let us turn to a question that inevitably arises for those familiar with Christian theology. How does Judaism interpret those places in the Tanakh, Hebrew Bible, that in the Christian tradition are perceived as evidence of the universal sinfulness of man? After all, in the Psalms there are words that seem quite bleak. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Psalm 51, verse 6. And in the book of Job, who can bring a clean thing out of an unclean? There is not one. Chapter 14, verse 4. How does Judaism read these texts? The Jewish tradition is well aware of these texts and offers different interpretations for them than those that developed in Christian theology. Psalm 51 is attributed to David and associated with his sin against Uriah and Bathsheba. The words conceived in iniquity in Jewish commentaries are interpreted in various ways. Some see in them a poetic expression of human vulnerability and imperfection, an acknowledgement that a person is by nature prone to error. Others link them to the specific circumstances of the psalmist's own birth and the circumstances of his origin. Still others point out that these are the words of a person in deep repentance, exaggerating his guilt from the depth of his experience, not a theological statement about the nature of every person. The word unclean, in the context of the verse from Job in the Jewish reading, refers primarily to ritual impurity associated with the physical processes of birth, not to a moral flaw. In any case, individual poetic expressions in Psalms and Job cannot outweigh the clear, direct statements in the Torah and the prophets that guilt is not transferred and that each person is responsible for their own deeds. In Jewish hermeneutics, poetic language is interpreted in light of direct legislative language, not the other way around. When the literal text of Deuteronomy says, "Each shall die for his own sin," and the poetic lines of a psalm allow for several readings, then the direct text takes precedence over the poetic. It is also worth mentioning how Judaism understands death, another area where the two traditions diverge significantly. In Christian theology, death is the punishment for Adam's sin. The wages of sin is death, Romans 6:23. In Judaism, the attitude toward death is more complex and less unambiguous. Yes, in the 3rd chapter of Genesis, God tells Adam that he will die. For dust you are, and to dust you shall return. But mortality in the Jewish understanding is not primarily a punishment. It is a condition of human existence, part of what it means to be created, not eternal. Precisely because life is finite, every moment has weight. Precisely because one cannot postpone doing good indefinitely, every choice matters. In a sense, mortality makes the moral life serious. When discussing what Judaism offers instead of original sin, one cannot fail to mention the concept of the chosen people, because it often causes misunderstandings precisely in this context. If every person is born with a pure soul and is responsible only for their own actions, then why the Torah at all? Why the commandments? Why a special covenant with the Jewish people? Judaism answers this question as follows. The Torah is not a tool for salvation from inherent sinfulness. The Torah is a guide to life, an instruction on how to live correctly, how to build a just society, how to develop one's relationship with God. It is not a ladder out of a pit. It is a map for a journey. A person does not need the Torah to escape a state of curse. They need the Torah to live well, correctly, righteously, in accordance with the Creator's design. This is a fundamental difference. The Torah as salvation from a curse, or the Torah as a guide to goodness. The Jewish people, in the Jewish understanding, are not privileged by nature and are not born with less Yetzer Hara, evil inclination. They are a people who took upon themselves a special obligation to observe the commandments of the Torah. This is more responsibility, not less. At the Sinai revelation, as described by the Torah, God offered the Torah to other nations, and they refused because it made too stringent demands. Israel accepted it, and thereby accepted a special responsibility. A non-Jew who leads a righteous life according to the 7 Noahide laws, universal moral principles obligatory for all humanity, is considered a righteous person in the Jewish understanding. The Talmud states, "The righteous of all nations have a share in the world to come." Judaism does not hold the idea that a non-Jew is inherently doomed or that they need the Torah for salvation. This is another consequence of the absence of original sin. Judaism is not a missionary religion in the Christian sense. Christianity brings the gospel, the good news, to the entire world because without it, all people are in a state of sin, unable to save themselves by their own strength. Judaism does not bring the Torah to the entire world because, in the Jewish understanding, every person already has what they need for a righteous life: reason, conscience, free will, and the 7 Noahide laws. Finally, it is worth mentioning how this theological difference is reflected in the practical life of a believer. In Christianity, especially in Protestant traditions, the consciousness of one's own sinfulness, total dependence on grace, and the impossibility of becoming righteous by one's own strength are an important part of the religious experience. I am a sinner, saved only by grace. This is not only a theological formula, it is an existential position, a way of understanding oneself. The emphasis on the total depravity of man in the Reformed tradition, the intense experience of conversion as a moment of transition from a state of condemnation to a state of justification, all this grows out of the doctrine of original sin. In Judaism, the position is fundamentally different. A Jew praying in the synagogue on Yom Kippur acknowledges their specific sins, collective and personal. The Vidui prayer, the confession, enumerates various categories of sins. We have sinned. We have transgressed. We have acted wickedly. This list is long and honest, but the Jew acknowledges them not as a manifestation of their irreparably corrupt nature, but as specific missteps made during the year. After this acknowledgement, they await forgiveness, not because God has condescended to their fundamental inability to be better, but because they genuinely intend to be better in the coming year. This is not a humble acceptance of one's own powerlessness. It is an honest conversation between a person aware of their responsibility and God who demands this responsibility. In Jewish theology, there is the idea that God created man precisely because he wanted a relationship with a being capable of genuine choice. God did not want puppets blindly following his will. He wanted a partner in the covenant, a being that could say yes or no, and that says yes consciously. It is free will that makes human righteousness valuable. It is the ability to choose evil that makes the choice of good significant. In this sense, the absence of original sin in Judaism is not a simplification of the picture of man, but its complication. Not man is weak, needs salvation, but man is capable, and that is precisely why he is held accountable. This is a more demanding view, not a more lenient one. Perhaps it is here, in this difference between I am a sinner by nature and I am a person who makes mistakes, that the deepest divergence between the two traditions lies. Not in the details of theological doctrines, but in that basic self-perception which these doctrines shape. Christian anthropology in its classical form presupposes humility as the recognition of one's own fundamental inability without God. Jewish anthropology presupposes responsibility as the recognition of one's own fundamental ability to choose, and consequently, to answer for that choice. Both positions are based on real spiritual experience, and it would be unfair to pretend that one of them is dishonest. The experience of one's own powerlessness before certain temptations, the impossibility of changing oneself by willpower alone, this is a real experience, familiar to many people regardless of religious beliefs. And Christian theology, with its concept of grace, honestly responds to this experience. The experience that a person is capable of rising after a fall, that teshuvah, repentance, is real. That yesterday's sinner can become today's righteous person, this is also a real experience, and Judaism honestly responds to it. Rabbinic literature is full of stories about people who committed grave sins and returned, and these stories are told not as exceptions, but as the norm, as something everyone is capable of. Perhaps ultimately this difference is not so much a divergence in facts about human nature, but a divergence in emphasis. What exactly needs to be emphasized? Man's dependence on God, or man's responsibility before God? Frailty or capability? Need for salvation or call to righteousness? Both traditions, if followed deeply enough, discover that both of these dimensions are necessary. Judaism knows the experience of dependence on God in prayer, in the covenant, in historical trials when only His help made survival possible. Christianity knows the call to responsibility. You are the light of the world. Love one another. Do good. But the starting points are different, and this makes the entire path different. The most important thing to take away from this investigation is not a theological scheme, but the practical question of how a person raised in one system or another looks at themselves. A person who is told from childhood that they carry a hereditary flaw begins their journey from one point. A person who is reminded every morning that their soul is pure and that what they will be today depends on them begins from another. This does not mean that one approach is better than the other in an absolute sense. It means that they form different people with different self-perceptions, with different senses of responsibility, with different images of what God expects from them. Judaism says, God created you capable. He gave you a pure soul. He gave you the Torah as a guide. He gave you teshuvah as an opportunity to correct yourself after a fall. He does not demand from you what you cannot do. He demands precisely what you can. And because you can, you are held accountable. Why is there no original sin in Judaism? Because the text of the 3rd chapter of Genesis in the Jewish reading does not teach it. There is no word sin, no transmission of guilt, no corruption of nature. Because the book of Ezekiel says the opposite with crystal clarity. Guilt is individual and not inherited. because the principle of individual responsibility is the foundation of the entire Jewish legal and theological system, because the concept of free will is absolute and is the basis for the 613 commandments, because the concept of Yetzer Hara explains man's inclination to sin without the need to postulate hereditary corruption of nature, because the system of teshuvah, of return, needs a person capable of returning, not a person fundamentally incapable of walking the right path without external help. And in the end, because from this follows a fundamentally different image of man, not one carrying guilt for another's sin, but one carrying responsibility for their own choice. This is a greater responsibility than it might seem at first glance, but it is also a greater dignity. The recognition that man is created capable, that God expects from him not sympathetic acceptance of his weakness, but real effort. That the commandments are given not to show man his inadequacy, but to show him what he is capable of. That the story Judaism tells about man is not a story of a fall, but of maturation. And maturation, as is known, requires not redemption, but responsibility. Another important detail worth adding at the end. Judaism does not deny that man needs God. Prayer, covenant, gratitude, request for help. All this constitutes the living fabric of Jewish religious life. The difference is not in whether God is needed, but in why he is needed. In Christian anthropology in its strict form, God is needed to pull man out of the pit of hereditary corruption. In Jewish anthropology, God is needed as a partner in the covenant, as a source of guidelines for life, as the one who hears prayer and responds to turning, not because man is broken, but because man is created for these relationships. This difference is not minor. From it grow two different ways of building religious life, two different images of God, two different images of oneself. One book, two readings, and two worlds that grew from one text, precisely because one small textual emphasis ultimately determines how a person looks at themselves every morning when they wake up. One book, one story about man in the garden, about the forbidden fruit, about the exit from Eden, and two completely different answers to the question of what this story says about the nature of every subsequent person. In this difference lies the entire meaning of the divergence we have discussed today.